The Lamp and the Secret Flame. Voices of the Cambridge Apostles. Episode 1. Narrator. George Tomlinson. Founder, 1820s. I remember the hush of that late spring evening in 1820 when the idea first stirred in my mind. My name is George Tomlinson, then a young undergraduate at Trinity College, Cambridge. Britain was at a crossroads in those post-Napoleonic years. Old orders were fading, and new voices, romantic poets, radical thinkers, rose to challenge the stiff orthodoxy that lingered about these ancient courts and cloisters. I shared with a few kindred spirits a hunger for deeper philosophical inquiry, unbound by the constraints of official curricula. It was not enough for us merely to excel in mathematics or theology. We wanted a society, small, private, dedicated to the free pursuit of truth, no matter how bold or contrarian it might appear. We met for the first time in a cramped chamber I had borrowed from a sympathetic fellow, a friend who admired our audacity, though he would not join us. Officially, we called ourselves the Cambridge Conversazione Society, a modest name for a circle of young men who aspired to debate the ultimate nature of knowledge and being. But among ourselves, the word apostles took hold, half tongue-in-cheek, half romantic tribute to our sense of mission. I was not entirely sure how that moniker began. Some whispered it was because we aimed to spread the gospel of truth, however heretical it might prove to be. That evening, by candlelight, I surveyed the small group. There was John Allen, who had a keen mind for theology and a penchant for provocative questions. There was Richard Sheepshanks, witty and sharp in his assessments. And there were others whose names now slip from memory, friends who came and went in those early years as the apostles had not yet solidified into the form it would later take. But in that moment, none of us suspected that what we began in modest earnest would, in future decades, attract some of the greatest minds of Britain, poets, philosophers, and statesmen alike. Our very first debate concerned a pressing dilemma of the post-Napoleonic age. Should the pursuit of truth acknowledge the constraints of our inherited institutions or strive to overturn them in radical leaps? Here at Cambridge, tradition weighed heavily upon all. We read Euclid and Aristotle, Augustine and Aquinas, each in a prescribed manner. But the world had changed. Revolutions, American, French, had rattled Europe. Was it enough to refine existing institutions, or should one upend them? I opened that debate with a note of caution. We stand on ancient ground, I said, glancing at the medieval arches outside the small window. Yet the world beyond these walls is in tumult. New voices demand a thorough re-evaluation of how societies are structured. I propose that, as men of reason and conscience, we cannot simply reaffirm the old order. We must interrogate it. A rumble of approval, then the hush returned as one of my new colleagues took the floor. John Allen, tall and bespectacled, cleared his throat. We are, after all, in the cradle of Newton and Milton. This university has championed intellect and imagination. But institutions, monarchy, church, even the halls of Cambridge, remain suspicious of radical change. My question is, can we do the greatest good by working within these institutions, or must we break them apart? His voice wavered slightly with the weight of the question. Richard Sheepshanks shot back, arms folded. Allen, I think you overestimate the capacity of old institutions to reform. They will stifle you, make a puppet of you. Better to articulate ideas freely, even if it leads to conflict with those in power. He paused, raising an eyebrow. Why else gather in such secrecy, if not to plan some intellectual revolution? I coughed lightly, uncertain. We do not intend conspiracy, I replied with a faint grin. But we must be free to speak without fear of censure. In that first debate, more than half the night was spent wrangling over the tension between tradition and transformation. Some insisted that the best course was to remain embedded in the known structures to gently coax them forward. Others advocated for a more audacious break, if not revolution, at least radical critiques. By dawn, we had reached no neat conclusion, but I recall feeling a stirring pride that we had freely pressed at the boundaries of orthodoxy. We parted with the vow to convene again, each carrying the heady sense of belonging to something new, something that might matter. Over the coming weeks, the group grew. Word spread quietly through Trinity and Saint. John's, a small but brilliant society, convened to debate everything. We discussed ethics, politics, metaphysics. Some nights we shared passages of poetry. On other occasions, we dissected theological arguments until each of us felt mentally spent. We maintained secrecy primarily because we feared the watchful eyes of conservative fellows. The university was not always gentle with radical thinkers, and we wanted to keep our flame alive without interference. Though small, we soon discovered that our diversity of backgrounds and viewpoints was extraordinary. Some were devout Christians, others leaning towards skeptical rationalism. Still others found solace in romanticism, enthralled by the works of Wordsworth or Byron. The friction of these perspectives lent urgency to our gatherings. We were not content to read passively. We engaged with living ideas, forging them in the crucible of debate. In those earliest years, I often found myself in a position of reluctant leadership. I tried to keep us aligned, to ensure each meeting had a topic that tested our intellectual boundaries. One night, for instance, we read an essay by William Hazlitt on the nature of genius. Another time, we dissected an oration by Edmund Burke. In everything, we demanded rigorous argumentation, but also a certain courtesy. Our aim was to refine each other's thinking, not simply to triumph. I remember how precarious the whole endeavor felt. More than once, we worried that a don might catch wind of our private society and shut us down. So, we kept our membership small, often holding gatherings in rotating rooms. We would slip quietly down corridors, hushed footsteps on ancient stone, hearts pounding in that youthful excitement of forging something clandestine. It was never about rebellion for its own sake, but about preserving an environment where radical honesty was possible. Eventually, a certain tradition took shape. We would open the floor with an address from the convener, sometimes me, sometimes another. We would then present a question to the group, often derived from the interplay of reason and faith, or from the challenges of political reform. The paper, as we called it, was then read aloud. Discussion followed. We ended with a concluding reflection, where each man offered a final statement, and we parted into the night. This ritual, in various forms, would persist through the generations of apostles to come. At times, I questioned whether this fledgling group could have any real impact. We were so few, yet the intensity of our discussions and the sheer intellectual energy in that cramped space convinced me that we were forging something of value. Even if we never sparked a grand political upheaval, we were shaping each other's minds, forging convictions that would color our future endeavors, whether in the clergy, the law, journalism, or scholarship. Behind our debates loomed an urgent question: what is truth? We read Francis Bacon's words about the idols of the mind and wanted to test ourselves against every idol: tradition, authority, even our own prejudices. That first year, the friction was often painful. Friendships could be strained when one man's cherished belief was dissected with cold logic. But there was an unspoken vow: we would not relent in pursuit of clarity. One lively night, John Allen argued that the monarchy, though flawed, provided necessary stability. Another member, who called himself a Benthamite, demanded the dismantling of archaic privileges. The conversation grew heated. "You speak as though people are reasoned creatures," Allen chided, "but man's passions run deep. Without the anchor of long-standing institutions, we risk anarchy." Our Benthamite friend smirked. "Better an honest anarchy than a suffocating chain of tradition." Gasps, a swirl of arguments, references to the French Revolution, even an allusion to ancient Rome. I had to step in to maintain order, yet I felt the thrill of minds in full engagement. Amid these debates, I was keenly aware that I was forging my own identity. The same was true for each of us. We tested arguments, we tested ourselves. Some discovered they were far more radical or more conservative than they had initially believed. Looking back, it strikes me that the fundamental gift of the apostles was not to provide all the answers, but to hone the questions. Near the end of that first year, we formalized our membership somewhat. We decided upon certain informal tenets, mostly dealing with intellectual honesty and friendship. The secrecy was never meant for mischief. It was a protective measure, ensuring we could speak our minds. I remember writing a brief set of guiding principles, though we never framed them as rigid rules. The hallmark of the apostles was always an aversion to dogma. I can still see the shadowy flicker of candlelight in that small, book-lined room. I can hear the murmurs of agreement and dissent. For me, 1820 was the year that changed everything, a time when I found my calling not just as a student of theology, but as someone who believed wholeheartedly in the power of open inquiry. I knew that beyond these walls, the world was vast and complicated. The Cambridge Apostles were my training ground for grappling with that complexity. On one of our final nights of the term, we returned to the question with which we had begun. Should truth bow to institution, or should institutions bow to truth? I rose to speak. Brothers, I have come to believe that truth must remain paramount. Yet, I have also come to see that change, if too abrupt, can devour itself. We need both the radical's vision and the cautious steps of those who respect the past. I paused, glancing around. Perhaps the best we can do is continue to ask, and ask again, where to draw that line. The hush that followed spoke louder than any applause. When term ended, a few of us returned to our homes in the countryside, or to London, or stayed on at Cambridge for more reading. The Apostles was still an embryo, uncertain in direction, but we were bound by a conviction that in the crucible of honest debate, something precious emerged. Each time we parted, I worried it might be for the last time, that the group would dissolve. But we always reconvened, drawn back like moths to a flame. Over those early months, we refined the art of conversation. We learned to listen, to respect, to challenge one another. The fellowship we formed transcended the ephemeral alliances of typical student clubs. We grew as thinkers, yes, but also as friends. Even when we fiercely disagreed, a bond deeper than ideology connected us, the shared pursuit of truth. It was not about winning. It was about seeing more clearly. As that first year passed into the second, rumors of our society began to spread. Now and then, someone would call us the Apostles. We pretended to be annoyed by the name, but in truth, we relished its sense of secret gravity. "How goes the gospel, Tomlinson?" friends would tease, mocking the piety of our group. But they did not understand that ours was no ordinary student circle. We believed we were forging a legacy. In time, one of our members, John Allen, would go on to become an influential churchman. Another would turn to radical journalism, lambasting the government of the day. As for me, I eventually devoted myself to the church, but with a certain intellectual boldness that always traced back to those earliest debates. Whatever paths we took, we carried forward the seeds planted in the apostles' gatherings. We disagreed on everything else, but we agreed that no idea was too sacred to examine. Thus ended the dawn of the Cambridge Apostles. With me, George Tomlinson, at its inception, we hovered between tradition and transformation, forever debating whether the truths we cherished should be tempered by the venerable institutions we inhabited. Our small group, flickering by candlelight in hidden rooms, would in time reach the ears and minds of men far beyond my imagining. But that is for others to tell. My part, I trust, has been to set the stage. Episode 2. Narrator, Alfred, Lord Tennyson, 1829 and onward. I was barely 20 when I joined the Apostles in 1829, though in memory it seems as though I was in the prime of youth, brimming with poetic ambition. I am Alfred Tennyson, who in later years would be recognized as poet laureate, but back then I was only a shy young man, hungry for words and experiences. My friend and muse, Arthur Hallam, had whispered to me about this secret society, a place where intellect and imagination entwined. At first, I hesitated, unsure if I could hold my own among the brilliant minds rumored to gather. but Arthur insisted, and I acquiesced. I recall ascending the narrow staircase to a modest room in Trinity, heart thrumming like a drum. The hush of anticipation enveloped me. 4 or 5 young men were already seated, among them Arthur, whose presence buoyed my courage. The flicker of lamplight cast tall shadows on the walls, epic silhouettes that fueled my imagination. One of the older members, Francis Garden, introduced me to the group with a warmth that eased my nerves. I was Tennyson, in their parlance. No formalities, no titles, just a fellowship of equals. That night's debate centered on the nature of genius, a topic that stirred my poetic soul. Could genius be learned, or was it innate? Did it spring from divine inspiration, or was it merely the fruit of dedicated labor? Having read Shelley and Wordsworth with feverish devotion, I leaned toward the belief that genius mingled the magical and the mundane, a spark of inspiration shaped by discipline. But I held my tongue at first, preferring to observe the conversation. Arthur Hallam spoke with typical eloquence. Poetry, above all, is not a contrivance of skill. It emerges from a deep wellspring, an intangible union of the poet's innermost feelings with the universal truths of humanity. Yet skill shapes this raw power into form, making it communicable. The ring of his voice transfixed me. He had always possessed a startling clarity of thought. One of the others, a mathematics scholar named James Spedding, countered, "But might we not attribute all great achievements to persistent refinement? Even if one is granted a kernel of talent at birth, it is worthless without systematic cultivation." Arthur nodded, acknowledging the point, but pressed, "Then why do some, though they labor, never attain more than mediocrity? There must be something indefinable, an inward vision that cannot be taught." At length, I ventured my own tentative contribution. There is a sense of the sublime, I think, which seizes the poet. It's akin to prophecy, yet prophecy without structure can be mere babble. So perhaps genius is a synergy, the flicker of the divine, harnessed by mortal discipline. I was conscious of my accent, of the hush that fell when I spoke. Yet the group received my words with thoughtful nods, encouraging me to go on. Over the following weeks, I discovered that what truly bound the apostles was not simply intellect, but an indefatigable curiosity. We read, we debated, we scribbled lines of verse, or jotted notes in the margins of philosophical tomes. The secret nature of our gatherings created a sense of intimacy, a confessional atmosphere in which we risked exposing our most daring ideas. For me, it was an essential crucible. I tested out early stanzas of what would become my poetic style, receiving candid feedback from those who cared more for truth than for flattery. Arthur Hallam and I grew especially close. We strolled the meadows near the Cam, discussing the interplay of poetry and philosophy. "We must forge new forms," Arthur would say, "without discarding the grandeur of the old. The Greek epics, the Elizabethan stage, they teach us timeless patterns. But we live in the 19th century, faced with industrial progress, political unrest. Our verse must speak to this era." I listened, enthralled, shaping my lines to capture both the timeless and the contemporary. One key idea that year was the question of religious doubt. Several apostles wrestled with the rising tide of skepticism. The old certainties seemed eroded by scientific inquiry and historical criticism of the Bible. While devout members urged caution, others, like Richard Monckton Milnes, pushed a more liberal theological stance. "We cannot cling blindly to dogma," Milnes insisted one night. "Faith must be tested by reason." Arthur and I often found ourselves in the middle, acknowledging the beauty of Christian tradition, yet sensitive to the roiling undercurrent of doubt that marked our generation. "For me," Arthur explained, "religion is woven into poetry. To unravel one is to unravel the other. But I cannot pretend that reason has no part in the tapestry. Let us not fear honest scrutiny." Some nights the debates grew intense, but we always parted with an embrace of friendship. It was during one such meeting that I witnessed the apostles' capacity for fierce yet respectful contention. A devout member, Frederick Maurice, argued passionately that the essence of Christianity was the surest ground for morality. An equally fiery voice contended that moral sense could exist independently of Christian revelation. Voices rose, references to Lockean empiricism and Kantian ethics flew about. I felt my heart pound. This was no idle conversation, but a battleground of convictions. At that debate, I stayed mostly silent, my mind churning. The clash of ideas fascinated me, yet I sensed something larger at stake, the future direction of thought in an increasingly uncertain age. When they turned to me for an opinion, I quoted from my embryonic poem, The Mystic. "'Tis not a question of creed or code, but whence within the heart is sowed the love that makes a god of man." It was a rough line, but it conveyed my inkling that beyond the letter of doctrine lay a divine spark in our very being. Outside of our formal gatherings, life flowed in typical Cambridge rhythms. I studied, read poetry to Arthur and others, took long walks by the Cam. I still remember the bloom of spring along the backs, the gentle hush of the water. The apostles, though secret, touched every aspect of my life. Over dinners in college halls, I would exchange cryptic glances with fellow members, recalling the fervent conversation of the night before. Amid this intellectual ferment, the camaraderie we shared was electric. I recall one comedic episode when Arthur and I, both exhausted by intense reading of German philosophy, tried to amuse ourselves by rewriting a Shakespeare sonnet in the style of Hegel. We read our parody at an apostles' meeting, eliciting roars of laughter. Despite the seriousness of our mission, we were young, full of mischief and wit. That sense of playfulness kept us from succumbing to pretension. Tragically, the brightness of our fellowship was fated to dim. In 1833, Arthur Hallam died suddenly while traveling abroad. The news shattered me. I retreated into a private world of grief, unable to make sense of the loss. The apostles rallied around me, offering compassion and understanding. They too mourned Arthur, an intellect so luminous that we had expected him to reshape English letters or politics. His absence left an unfillable void. That year, in my mourning, I wrestled with a crisis of faith. Why would God snatch away so brilliant a soul so young? My nights were riddled with doubt, my days tinged with sorrow. Yet I found some measure of solace in the memory of our spirited apostles' debates. Arthur himself had taught me not to shrink from difficult questions, so I turned my grief into verse. Over the ensuing years, that verse became my extended elegy in Memoriam AHH, in which I grappled with faith, doubt, and the problem of suffering. The apostles played a crucial role in shaping the poem. Though we no longer convened quite as frequently, the spirit of our dialogues echoed in my stanzas. I saw how each line might form a point of debate, a platform for exploring the tension between science and religion, hope and despair. I recalled nights when we probed the mysteries of existence, forging friendships that transcended dogmatic boundaries. Even in my loneliness, I felt the presence of those who had once sat with me in the flickering lamplight. Years passed, and I emerged from the darkest corridors of grief, though never quite free of it. My star rose in the literary world, with poems such as Locksley Hall and later The Princess. Yet the imprimatur of the apostles was always upon me. Our confidential gatherings had taught me to fuse imagination with rigorous self-examination. In the lines of Ulysses, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield, echoed the rebellious spirit of those debates where no truth was off limits. Sometimes old apostles would meet in London parlours, reminiscing about Cambridge days and the absent voice of Arthur. He was our guiding star, more than one confided. Indeed, in certain ways, Hallam had been the embodiment of the society's ethos, a bridging of classical erudition and modern daring, a reverence for beauty, tempered by a rational mind. Our continuing bond felt like a testament to the intangible power of friendship grown in pursuit of truth. The years revealed to me that the Apostles was not merely a group of bright undergraduates. It was a living tradition of intellectual fellowship, handed down from those who came before and passed on to those who followed. To this day, I believe that the quiet discussions I witnessed as a young man shaped the direction of my poetry. They gave me courage to delve into the heart of doubt, to challenge facile answers, yet also to find solace in a higher unity of thought and feeling. One debate in particular stands out in memory, this one held shortly before Arthur's death in the summer of 1832. We tackled the question, what is the poet's responsibility to society? Ought the poet address social ills or remain a solitary singer? Arthur contended that the poet was a prophet for his age, obligated to illuminate moral truths. James Spedding, by contrast, argued that poetry's first duty was to aesthetic form, not moral instruction. I could see wisdom in both stances. In the hush that followed their impassioned exchange, I felt an almost holy aura in the room. That silent communion steered me for years afterward. In my own verse, I sought a synthesis, to craft language of beauty and depth, while also acknowledging the moral storms buffeting the modern world: industrialization, class struggle, religious doubt. The seeds for this ambition were planted in that dimly lit chamber, with half a dozen youthful voices contending, laughing, consoling. The apostles taught me that language wields power, the power to clarify thought, to bridge hearts, to question injustice. As I grew older, recognized across Britain, I sometimes felt a pang of nostalgia for those secret nights by the Cam. The public demanded laureate poems for royal ceremonies, demanded that I become the voice of Victorian respectability. Yet within me, I still heard the echoes of the apostles' candor, the fearless discarding of stale conventions. I strove to keep that spirit alive, though my official role required a certain decorum. I recall once meeting a young man at a literary salon who whispered that he, too, was an apostle. Decades separated us, yet in that moment we were equals, linked by the memory of intense conversation, the abiding sense that truth matters more than status or show. We shared stories of midnight debates, the controversies of theology, the metamorphoses of political thought. It gratified me to see that the lineage continued, shaped by each new generation. And so, dear reader, if I may borrow that form, my time among the apostles was as vital a part of my education as reading Homer or writing reams of verse. We debated big questions: art, faith, progress, compelled by a zeal to push the boundaries of accepted knowledge. From those candlelit gatherings, I carried forward a luminous fire, fueled by the memory of Arthur Hallam and kindred spirits who believed in the union of reason and imagination. Whenever I pen a line that resonates in the heart of another, I sense the legacy of those dialogues reverberating still. Episode 3. Narrator: Henry Sidgwick, Mid-Victorian Era, 1860s to 1870s. I, Henry Sidgwick, came to the Apostles at a time of intellectual ferment in Britain, the mid-Victorian era. Born in 1838, I arrived at Trinity College a generation after Tennyson and Hallam, yet the echoes of their presence lingered. The society had grown more established by the 1860s, though it retained its aura of secrecy. I was initially drawn to the study of classics, then of moral philosophy. My hunger was for systematic thought, ethics, metaphysics, and the apostles provided the perfect crucible for refining these passions. To my delight, I found that the group continued to debate theology, literature, and politics with the same fervor Tennyson had described in earlier years. But the times were changing. Darwin's On the Origin of Species, 1859, had unleashed a storm of controversy, and the unstoppable rise of German higher criticism challenged the historical reliability of Scripture. Many of us wrestled with faith, teetering between the Anglican traditions and agnostic or even atheist positions. That tension formed the backdrop of our debates. Some apostles, devout by temperament, argued that Darwin's theories did not necessarily negate divine design. Others were more radical. Evolution dethrones the old God, they claimed. My own position was nuanced. I believed that moral intuition pointed to something transcendent, but I could not blithely ignore the scientific evidence. The apostles' debate stretched my mind, forcing me to examine every assumption, every cherished belief, in the searing light of reason. One of the most memorable controversies concerned the extension of education to women. As a teacher at Cambridge, I sensed the injustice of excluding women from proper academic recognition. In 1869, I helped found Newnham College, an institution for the higher education of women. Among the apostles, the question of women's intellectual capacity and rights sparked heated discussions. Some insisted that the female mind was inherently different, suited more to nurturing roles. I and several others contended that mental faculties were not so simply gendered. One evening, I presented a paper titled On the Justice of Women's Emancipation, in which I argued that reason and fairness demanded women be allowed the same educational opportunities as men. A hush fell when I finished. Then someone gently teased me for my radical mania, but I could sense the genuine respect beneath the jest. Richard Claverhouse Jebb, a scholar of Greek, pointed out how classical Athens had restricted women's roles, yet produced philosophical giants. If we glean wisdom from the ancients, he mused, should we not also learn from their limitations? The debate that night was lively, culminating in no consensus but a deeper collective reflection. The next major idea we tackled was the moral dimension of utilitarianism. Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill had enthralled many thinkers. Mill's concept of maximizing happiness found supporters even among the apostles, but others were skeptical. Can moral truth be reduced to a mere calculus of pleasure? Asked an older member, his brow furrowing. I had sympathy for the utilitarian framework, but felt it insufficient for certain moral intuitions, duties, the sense of right that goes beyond mere utility. As was our custom, a designated speaker presented a paper, and we dissected it line by line. That night, the speaker argued that all moral rules could be derived from the principle of the greatest happiness for the greatest number. I rose to respond, drawing from my own budding philosophical stance. Yet we find in ourselves obligations that defy straightforward calculation. Think of truth-telling. Even if a lie might produce overall pleasure, does not conscience still condemn it? The room erupted with voices. What if the lie prevents a greater harm? What if your conscience is shaped by cultural conditioning? So it went until dawn threatened to break. That was the hallmark of the apostles, an unyielding effort to dissect every premise. Outside these debates, our camaraderie thrived in simpler joys. Dinner gatherings, walks along the backs, shared jokes about some arcane footnote in Kant. The anonymity of the society, ironically, forged a strong sense of trust. We knew we could speak freely, unguarded. For me, a shy and methodical thinker, this was crucial. I never felt overshadowed or mocked. The only standard was the rigorous pursuit of truth. An important shift in the apostles' culture came with the admission, albeit quietly, of men whose faith was minimal or even non-existent. In earlier generations, open atheism might have been unthinkable, but now the winds of modernity blew strong. We had debates on whether the moral law required a theistic foundation. Some insisted that morality was unimaginable without God. Others saw moral principles as a product of human sympathy and rational evolution. I recall a particularly intense exchange with Frederick William Maitland, a brilliant legal historian. He contended that ethical behavior could be derived from societal needs for stability and cooperation, requiring no divine sanction. Yet, I retorted, what enjoins me to be ethical when society cannot see my action, or when evil may benefit me? Maitland's answer, conscience itself, shaped by centuries of social evolution, becomes the internal arbiter. I was intrigued, but not wholly convinced. Amid these heady discourses, I was developing my own ethical theories, which would later appear in my book, The Methods of Ethics, 1874. Though I did not explicitly cite the apostles, the impetus of those late-night debates shaped my chapters on intuitionism and utilitarianism. Our discussions forced me to integrate conflicting perspectives. The result was an attempt to reconcile the intuitive sense of duty with the utilitarian calculus of outcomes. Another topic that repeatedly emerged was the role of the British Empire. We were living in an age of expansive colonialism. Some members, proud of Britain's global stature, defended the empire as a civilizing force. Others decried the exploitation and moral blindness inherent in subjugating distant peoples. The apostles soared into big questions. Do we have the right to impose our culture on others? Does might make right, or do moral duties extend beyond national borders? One night, I presented a paper titled Imperialism and Moral Responsibility. In it, I argued that while commerce and global exchange could foster progress, we must never lose sight of the inherent dignity of all human beings. Any claim of British superiority, I posited, must be tested against the deeper moral truths that transcend national identity. A fervent exchange ensued. But what of the savage practices we stamp out? Someone asked. Another shot back. By what standard do you declare them savage? We parted that night unresolved, but more aware of the moral complexities swirling around Britain's imperial project. The apostles also retained a measure of playfulness. We might wrestle with the logic of John Stuart Mill for hours, then relax by reading each other satirical sketches. I remember how James Fraser, who would later write The Golden Bough, once performed an impromptu parody of a Catholic Mass, satirizing the anthropological underpinnings of ritual. We howled with laughter, though some were scandalized. Such irreverent humor was a hallmark of the apostles, a willingness to poke fun at everything, including ourselves. I must also mention the charm of certain gatherings. We rotated hosting duties in small rooms cluttered with books. The smell of candle wax and tobacco smoke wreathed the air. At times, the conversation turned personal. Confidences were exchanged about private doubts, youthful misgivings, romantic entanglements. That sense of brotherhood, though the group was never large, cemented our loyalty. Even after we parted ways in life, we remained tethered by those nights of truth-seeking. And so it was that we grappled with one central debate in my final year as a consistently attending apostle. Can reason alone lead us to a just society, or do we require religious or moral sentiments as well? Several sessions delved into this question. Some, influenced by Comte's positivism, believed that scientific progress would eventually yield rational social structures. Others, echoing Edmund Burke, insisted that society needs the glue of tradition, custom, and spiritual orientation. I contributed my own perspective, gleaned from my ethical research. Pure reason can reveal inconsistencies and improve our systems, but it cannot by itself bestow the warmth of moral conviction. There must be a confluence of rational argument and the innate moral sense, whether we see that sense as God-given or evolved. Without the heart's assent, the intellect's formulas remain cold. Maitland, half smiling, responded, "But is that moral sense not just the residue of old superstitions?" We wrestled back and forth. No final verdict emerged, but we sharpened each other. When I look back on my time with the apostles, I see how it influenced more than just my academic endeavors. It shaped my stance toward progressive causes, women's education, the professionalization of academia, social reforms. The moral seriousness of the group, combined with the willingness to test every assumption, honed my conviction that reasoned debate must underpin all social change. Yet it also taught me humility, that no single system of thought has all the answers. Some nights I yearned for the certainty that faith once gave me. I had started as a devout Anglican, but the collisions of modern knowledge with doctrinal tradition left me unsettled. In the apostles, I found a safe place to voice my uncertainties. We dissected, discussed, and argued, sometimes soothing each other's anxieties, sometimes inflaming them. But the end result was not despair. Rather, it was a deeper acceptance that partial truths and earnest striving might be the best we humans can attain. Long after I became a lecturer, and eventually a professor, I cherished my membership in the society. Younger men, and quietly, a handful of extraordinary minds who would soon push for broader inclusivity, arrived, carrying forward the torch. I tried to instill in them the same dedication to intellectual integrity and fearless questioning. Our motto, unspoken, was Amico di virtù e di letteratura, friends of virtue and letters. This spirit kept us going, forging an unbroken chain of inquiry across generations. My own crowning achievement, The Methods of Ethics, was published in 1874. Though I had wrestled with the text for years, I can trace many passages to specific apostles' debates. The notion that we might reconcile utilitarianism with intuitionism, examining the strengths and weaknesses of both, emerged from those late-night dialogues. Some critics found my conclusions too hesitant, too cautious, but I was more interested in clarity than dogmatic certainty. That, I believe, is the apostles' way. One day, as I was gazing at the stained glass windows of Trinity's chapel, I reflected on how many luminaries had passed through these halls, each shaping the apostles in turn. From Tennyson's poetic fervour to the radical empiricists of my generation, the society served as a crucible of thought. An invisible lineage bound us across time. Even as external society changed, from the ascension of Queen Victoria to the expansions of empire and the stirrings of labour unrest, the apostles remained an enclave of reflection. Our sense of tradition was ironically married to an urgency for reform. We revered some aspects of Cambridge's history, the legacy of Newton, the scholarship of centuries, while urging the institution to evolve, especially in matters like women's education and religious tests. I like to think that the apostles formed a conscience at the heart of the university, whispering for change even as the official powers moved slowly. And if we sometimes overstated our influence, well, that was part of being young idealists. As I pen these recollections, I sense the spirit of those debates still stirring in my mind. The memory of bright faces lit by lamplight, the echo of voices grappling with the biggest questions. These are not fleeting impressions. They are integral to who I became. If there is a single thread that runs through my life's work, it is the conviction that intellectual honesty and moral earnestness belong together, each buttressing the other. This, more than anything, was the gift the apostles gave me. And so I conclude my story, leaving it to the next narrators to speak of the society's journey in subsequent decades. But let me affirm this. The debates that roiled our circle over faith, reason, morality, and social justice were not mere academic exercises. They were the forging of a worldview that would resonate in countless policies, publications, and personal philosophies. In the hush of a secret meeting, amid old Cambridge stone, we pursued truth with all the ardour of our youth. The glow of that pursuit never truly fades. Episode 4. Narrator: John Maynard Keynes, early 20th century. My name is John Maynard Keynes. By the time I joined the Apostles in 1903, the society had passed through the hands of so many brilliant minds: poets, philosophers, moralists. I was a lanky, somewhat brash young man, with a mind trained on logic and mathematics, but drawn to the complexities of economics and politics. Little did I know then how the world would soon erupt into chaos, and how that small circle of Cambridge eccentrics would shape my thinking in profound ways. In the early 1900s, the Apostles included a number of remarkable individuals. Among them, Lytton Strachey, Leonard Woolf, and E.M. Forster would soon pass through. The spirit was different from Henry Sidgwick's era. Aesthetic sensibilities mingled with radical politics, and the conversation flowed freely about art, sexuality, pacifism, and the meaning of personal freedom. We were, many said, an odd mix of the intellectual and the bohemian. From my first meeting, I sensed a shift from the more formal debates of old to a style that was intimate, witty, and sometimes shockingly candid. We gathered in smoky rooms, perhaps with a bottle of wine secreted away, discussing the latest currents in philosophy and literature. I remember Lytton Strachey, in his languid drawl, delivering wickedly funny critiques of Victorian morality. Across from him, Leonard Woolf would pass the politics of socialism, fresh from his reading of Marx and the Fabian Society. One of the central ideas that preoccupied us was the nature of personal liberty in a modern industrial age. At a time when women were fighting for the vote, when labour movements were rising, and when the old social hierarchies were trembling, the question of liberty loomed large. Did individual freedom require a dismantling of class structures? Should property be redistributed? Or was personal freedom best served by a minimal state and a vibrant market? I, being an economist in training, found myself fascinated by the intricacies of these debates. At one meeting, I presented a paper titled On Individual Freedom and the Public Good, in which I argued that while markets could spur creativity and growth, they also produced inequalities that stifled many from realizing their potential. Lytton Strachey teased me for dabbling in the dismal science of economics, but then gave a thoughtful response. Market freedom is all very well, Keynes, but is it truly freedom if the majority are shackled by poverty and tradition? The room hummed in agreement and dissent. Leonard Woolf chimed in. A planned economy, to some extent, might allow for a more equitable distribution of resources, but at what cost to personal autonomy? I retorted that some planning could preserve autonomy by safeguarding the vulnerable from the brutalities of an unregulated market. This conversation, half formed in those youthful days, would echo in my later works when I challenged the orthodoxies of laissez-faire economics. We also debated more abstract questions of aesthetics and modernism. E.M. Forster, shy yet incisive, would occasionally bring up the role of the novel in depicting human relationships. It's not politics alone that shapes society, Forster mused. It's the capacity of individuals to connect, to empathize, to see each other's inner lives. Literature fosters that empathy, perhaps more effectively than a political treatise. I was intrigued, for my mind often gravitated to systematic theories, yet I could not deny the power of art to expand human sympathy. One significant tension in the group concerned pacifism. A few apostles advocated absolute nonviolence, pointing to the Boer War and the brewing tensions in Europe as evidence of militarism gone amok. Others thought pacifism naive, arguing that power politics demanded readiness for armed conflict. In 1908, we spent several sessions wrestling with the question, is there ever a just war? Lytton Strachey insisted that all war was a moral abomination. Another member contended that self-defense, at least, was justified. I found myself ambivalent, leaning toward pacifism in principle, but wary of ignoring the realities of aggression. It was in this environment that I formed the intellectual scaffolding for what would become my economic theories. The apostles taught me to see the human dimension behind abstract models. Economics was not merely about supply and demand curves. It was about the interplay of personal freedom, social justice, and the potential for creative flourishing. Our debates on moral philosophy, art, and politics seeped into my growing sense that government had a role to play in preventing ruinous cycles of boom and bust, a role that might actually enhance individual liberty by shielding people from catastrophic risk. The years rolled on, and the outbreak of the First World War in 1914 shattered our illusions of unbroken progress. Suddenly, the pacifist question was no longer abstract. Friends were conscripted or volunteered. Some apostles declared conscientious objection. I joined the Treasury, working on financial policies to support the war. My experience in government introduced me to the harsh realities of global conflict. Civilians starved. Nations teetered on the brink of collapse. In the midst of this turmoil, the apostles continued to meet, though less frequently. On occasional leaves or weekend breaks, I would find myself back in Cambridge, longing for the camaraderie of those late-night talks. The society now debated whether the war could ever be justified and how a lasting peace might be built. Pacifists in the group felt vindicated in their horror at the carnage, but others, including me, wrestled with the moral complexities. I could not wholeheartedly condemn the war effort while witnessing German atrocities in Belgium and France. During one tempestuous meeting in 1916, Lytton Strachey launched into a scathing indictment of the war, calling it a monstrous betrayal of civilization. He singled me out, somewhat unfairly, because of my work at the Treasury supporting Britain's financing of the conflict. I shot back, explaining that while I detested the slaughter, the alternative, an unchecked militarism from the Central Powers, seemed equally dreadful. The argument grew heated, but in typical apostles' fashion, ended in mutual, if uneasy, respect. We recognized that the war was forcing us to choose between evils. Those war years proved a crucible for my generation. By the time the armistice was signed in 1918, we had lost friends, including some from within our tight circle. The trauma of the conflict spurred me to write The Economic Consequences of the Peace, 1919, in which I warned of the dangers of a vindictive reparations policy against Germany. Looking back, I see how the seeds of that book and my approach to international affairs were planted in the Apostles' debates about moral responsibility and the nature of justice. Another major concern in the post-war era was the question of sexual morality. Some apostles were open homosexuals at a time when homosexuality remained illegal. This generated intense discussions about personal freedom, the tyranny of social norms, and the possibility of living authentically within a repressive society. Lytton Strachey and John Strachey, no relation, would recount the challenges faced by gay men in a culture that demanded silence. E. M. Forster, more reserved, occasionally hinted at similar yearnings. I, too, had my share of fluid affections. Though I eventually settled into a long-term relationship with Lydia Lopakova, those apostles' meetings underscored the courage it took to stand against the currents of conventional morality. I recall one debate in the early 1920s on whether private love was a matter for public concern. Some argued that consenting adults should be free of legal and social constraints, while others cautioned that completely dismantling moral codes could destabilize families. The intensity of these arguments reflected real personal stakes. We knew men who had been ostracized or worse because of their sexuality. Once again, the society served as a safe haven for unconventional thought. In the 1920s, the Bloomsbury Group came to prominence, featuring many old apostles, myself, Strachey, Woolf, Forster, and others who had carried the seeds of Cambridge's intellectual boldness into London's literary scene. We dined, drank, and sparred philosophically, forging new aesthetics in art and literature. While the Apostles remained a more private space, Bloomsbury's public face gave shape to a broader cultural revolution. Challenges to Victorian values, explorations of free love, critiques of capitalism, and so forth. Meanwhile, my own career soared. I became a central figure in British economic policy, particularly after the 1930 publication of my Treatise on Money, and later the General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, 1936. Through all this, the spirit of the Apostles' tradition guided me, an insistence on questioning orthodoxy, on blending empirical insight with moral concern. Where classical economists saw inviolable market laws, I saw human conventions that could be adapted for the common good. Yet for all my influence, I never forgot the humility that came from those nights in Cambridge, when a sarcastic retort from Strachey or a quietly devastating remark from Forster could puncture my certainties. The society taught me that no matter how brilliant one's theory, it must be tested in the arena of honest, merciless dialogue. And that, ironically, is how affection was also sustained, by never allowing each other to become complacent. The Great Depression of the 1930s thrust me into the public eye as an economic prophet of sorts. Governments scrambled to salvage their economies, and my ideas about using fiscal policy to spur demand gained traction. Behind the scenes, I would occasionally confide in old apostles about my fears. What if my solutions do not work? What if we create new problems? Their counsel, as always, was frank. Some teased me that I was flirting with socialism. Others worried that my theories didn't go far enough. Still, they reminded me to remain faithful to evidence and reason rather than dogma. As the 1930s gave way to the ominous rise of fascism in Europe, our conversations turned once again to the prospect of war. Many of us were older now, no longer youthful idealists. We saw Hitler's aggression, Mussolini's expansionism, Franco's tyranny in Spain. The question, is pacifism still viable, resurfaced. Leonard Woolf, with unwavering clarity, concluded that pacifism could not stop fascism. Even Strachey, once a fervent pacifist, began to soften his stance, though he remained horrified by the notion of armed conflict. When the Second World War broke out in 1939, It felt like a tragic repetition of history, but with even darker undertones. I worked furiously in Whitehall, advising the government on economic measures to sustain the war effort. There was no apostles' meeting as such. Too many of us were scattered, engrossed in the crisis. But in letters and rare gatherings, we tried to find moral clarity in the face of an existential threat. While our younger selves might have questioned the morality of war, the vast scale of Nazi atrocities seemed to overshadow such debates. Survival, it seemed, was non-negotiable. By the end of the war, I was in ill health, yet determined to shape the post-war economic order. I travelled to Bretton Woods in 1944, helping to design the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. My apostles' training, once again, was in the back of my mind. We had always insisted that intellectual frameworks must serve human welfare. Now I was forging global institutions meant to prevent future economic collapse. The scope was unprecedented, but the principle was the same. Test ideas against reality, and do not let orthodoxy stifle necessary innovation. I reflect now, in the twilight of my life, on what the apostles meant to me. We debated personal liberty, the role of the state, artistic expression, sexual morality, war and pacifism. We never quite settled any of it. Indeed, the world remains a messy place. But the real value lay in the fearless confrontation of complex issues, guided by a blend of wit, empathy, and intellectual rigor. We challenged each other to go beyond half-baked opinions, to refine arguments until they shone or cracked. And though I gained fame as an economist, I owe much to those early nights in smoky Cambridge rooms where I was forced to defend or reconsider every premise. The Society's ethos, suspicious of easy answers, relentlessly pursuing deeper understanding, became my lifelong methodology. In my career, whenever confronted by skeptics of state intervention or by socialists demanding total control, I'd recall the apostles' spirit. Weigh each claim carefully, avoid fanaticism, and remain open to compromise that enhances the common good. I pass the torch now to the next generation, well aware that the Cambridge apostles will continue to evolve, grappling with whatever new crises and questions the future holds. Yet the essence remains, a fellowship of minds, bound by mutual respect and a shared devotion to truth-seeking. As I step away from the public stage, I do so with a certain serenity, convinced that the world can be better if we harness reason and compassion together, a lesson I first learned under those ancient spires in the hush of clandestine conversation among friends. Episode 5. Narrator, Bertrand Russell, early to mid-20th century. I am Bertrand Russell, mathematician, logician, and philosopher. My relationship with the apostles began around 1892, though my most vivid recollections straddle the late Victorian and early 20th century eras, overlapping with John Maynard Keynes and many brilliant contemporaries. Now, in the aftermath of 2 world wars, I look back on the society that so profoundly shaped my life. If Keynes found in the apostles the impetus for economic revolution, I found the impetus for philosophical and social revolution, particularly concerning logic, pacifism, and nuclear disarmament. I recall the time I first entered that small room in Trinity. I was an undergraduate, newly enamored of mathematics and the crisp clarity it promised, a refuge from the muddle of everyday existence. The apostles, I soon discovered, were not content with neat formulae. They prodded me to examine the assumptions behind mathematics, behind language itself, behind the entire enterprise of knowledge. It was exhilarating and disorienting. In those early years, G.E. Moore was a central figure, a thoughtful presence with a moral earnestness that sometimes startled me. We engaged in the revolt against idealism, forging what would become analytic philosophy. The apostles' debates spilled into our academic work as Moore and I sought to ground truth in precise analysis rather than in Hegelian abstraction. Later, Ludwig Wittgenstein would join us, further shaking the foundations of philosophical inquiry. Though Wittgenstein was mercurial, the apostles gave him a platform for his early explorations of language and logic. One recurrent theme in the society during my membership was the quest for absolute clarity in thought. Could language truly capture reality? Or was all language a metaphor, a stumbling approximation? I championed a symbolic logic that might sweep away the cobwebs of fuzzy thinking. Late into the night, we pored over definitions, teased out paradoxes, and challenged each other's premises. It felt as though we stood on the brink of discovering a new intellectual continent. Another key debate concerned the interplay of scientific objectivity and moral responsibility. Some believed that the pursuit of truth was its own justification, that science should remain impartial, indifferent to moral concerns. Others, including me, argued that no knowledge is morally neutral, for the uses to which knowledge is put can shape the destiny of humanity. My pacifist inclinations emerged in part from these discussions, particularly as I witnessed the destructive potential of modern technology. During the First World War, I famously opposed Britain's involvement, leading to my dismissal from Trinity in 1916. The apostles were divided on the war question, as Keynes described. Some of my dear friends believed Britain had to fight. I disagreed vehemently, writing pamphlets against the conflict. Even though we parted ways on that issue, the apostles never turned its back on me. The society prized intellectual independence above all. If anything, my dissent was grudgingly respected. In the interwar years, I returned to Cambridge intermittently, though I immersed myself in public activism, advocating for pacifism, birth control, and social reform. I also taught in the United States for a time, fueling controversies. Nevertheless, the camaraderie of the apostles served as a moral and intellectual anchor, reminding me that rigorous thought and fearless debate must undergird any activism. Emotions alone, untempered by reason, lead to fanaticism. Reason alone, untempered by empathy, leads to cold detachment. Wittgenstein's involvement with the apostles was particularly fraught. He was deeply suspicious of societies, seeing them as distractions from the solitary pursuit of truth. Yet he attended our gatherings sporadically, mesmerizing us with his intensity. His Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, 1921, parted ways with the earlier approach Moore and I had championed. Still, the Society's ethos of open challenge allowed Wittgenstein to present his radical ideas without immediate dismissal. The nights when he clashed with Moore remain some of the most electric memories I carry. One evening, the debate turned to the possibility of verifying ethical propositions. Moore insisted that moral good was a simple, indefinable property. Wittgenstein scowled, claiming that ethical propositions were strictly nonsensical, expressions of attitude rather than truth statements. I tried to mediate, suggesting that language about ethics might be emotive but still meaningful. The conversation soared from the intricacies of logic to the nature of human values, culminating in a quiet hush. We realized we were wrestling with the limits of what could be said at all. Then came the specter of the Second World War. Once again, I was torn. I abhorred violence, but Hitler's regime represented a moral abyss. Keynes and I found ourselves in parallel struggles, though our positions evolved. By then, I recognized that fascism's aggression could not be resolved by pacifism alone. I swallowed my earlier absolutism, acknowledging that sometimes force must be met with force. Still, the heartbreak remained. How had humanity come to this point again? In the post-war world, a new terror emerged, the atomic bomb. To me, the development of nuclear weapons was a horrifying testament to unbridled scientific capability severed from moral wisdom. In the 1950s, I launched campaigns against nuclear proliferation, often partnering with Albert Einstein in our public statements. The question that the apostles had raised years before now glared in urgent capital letters. Can the pursuit of knowledge be truly neutral? My answer? No. If knowledge can extinguish humanity, we have a moral duty to constrain it. I recall an apostles' reunion in the early 1950s, informal, smaller, since many old friends had passed away or scattered. We convened in a dim room near Trinity, reminiscing about decades of arguments. Keynes was gone by then, having died in 1946. Moore was frail. I carried the weight of old age as well, but still blazed with a passion for logic and pacifism. We debated the nuclear arms race, with some members expressing fatalistic acceptance that the superpowers would never relinquish these weapons. I argued fervently that global cooperation was not only desirable, but necessary for survival. This final chapter of the apostles in my life was tinged with melancholy. The brilliant young men who once haunted these rooms, Hallam, Tennyson, Sidgwick, even Henry Jackson and others, were now figures of memory, some long departed. But new faces emerged, grappling with existentialism, post-war reconstruction, and the rising tide of decolonization. The group retained its essence, a haven for challenging discourse, unafraid to question orthodoxy. That continuity gave me solace, despite the world's uncertainties. One last major debate I recall was the tension between personal freedom and collective responsibility in the context of the Cold War. Some of the younger apostles had flirted with communism, outraged by capitalism's failings. Others, shaped by the horrors of Stalinism, championed Western liberal democracy despite its flaws. I, for my part, found both systems lacking if they prioritized power over the welfare of the individual. My position was that humanity needed rational problem-solving, dialogue, negotiation, and compromise, rather than dogmatic antagonisms. We concluded nothing definitive, but once again, the conversation stretched our moral imaginations. Throughout these transformations, the apostles remained steadfast in its refusal to become a mere social club or academic bureaucracy. We never wrote official minutes, never published a manifesto. Our secrecy was less about conspiracy than about safeguarding a zone of unvarnished honesty. In a public forum, reputations are at stake. In the apostles, we tested each other's convictions without fear of scandal. Of course, rumors circulated, especially about personal liaisons and radical leanings, but the public never truly grasped the nature of our fellowship. I should address one persistent misunderstanding. Some imagine the apostles as an elite conspiratorial network controlling British intellectual life. That is nonsense. Yes, many influential figures passed through our circle, statesmen, scholars, poets, philosophers, but the society never aimed for a coordinated agenda. Our only creed was the free exchange of ideas, rooted in mutual respect. If, by chance, we ended up shaping policy or culture, it was simply because intellectual courage tends to produce leadership. As I near the end of my recollections, I think back on the young man I was, eager, anxious, brimming with questions. The apostles gave me a stage to refine those questions, to meet minds as restless as my own. Together, we sculpted lines of reasoning that challenged Victorian piety, that championed sexual openness, that dissected the illusions of nationalism, that demanded academic rigor over mere tradition. If the society had produced only Tennyson's verses, or Sidgwick's ethics, or Keynes's economics, or my own explorations in logic, it would have been enough. But it did more, weaving a tapestry of debate that spans centuries. I cherish the memory of More's gentle voice asserting that good was indefinable, yet undeniably real. I recall Tennyson's lines, read aloud by an older apostle, resonating with heartbreak and grandeur. I see Keynes standing by the fireplace, gesturing animatedly as he forecast the collapse of laissez-faire. I hear Lytton Strachey's purring wit, dismantling social conventions with a flick of his tongue. And I feel the quiet intensity of Wittgenstein, whose eyes burned with a singular quest to pass the boundaries of language. Even as the world storms around us, nuclear threats, ideological battles, the fracturing of old empires, the apostles endures, not as a fortress, but as a lamp held aloft in the dark. The lamp illuminates the corners of ignorance, tradition-bound thinking, prejudice. Our debates have not cured the world's ills. They may never do so. Yet they have cultivated in each generation a handful of souls unafraid to question. That, I believe, is the best any society can offer. I imagine a future where technology redefines what it means to be human, where artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and global networks unleash powers unthinkable in my youth. The apostles will wrestle with these questions as we once wrestled with the moral dilemmas of war, empire, and sexuality. I trust that spirit of open inquiry will persist, the same daring curiosity that spurred George Tomlinson, Tennyson, Sidgwick, Keynes, and me. The questions morph, but the method remains. People sometimes ask if my pacifism or my activism, or even my forays into taboo subjects derive from the apostles. In part, yes. The society taught me that belonging to an intellectual community does not mean conformity, but encouragement to speak one's truth, to refine it under the glare of opposing arguments. That environment emboldened me to stand against war, to champion reason over superstition, to see moral discourse as inescapably public and urgent. Without the apostles, I might still have acted similarly, but the path would have been lonelier and less rigorous. In the final tally, the Cambridge Apostles is neither an institution nor a cult, but a living conversation across generations. Each new member picks up the threads of centuries-old debates on faith and reason, freedom and necessity, the self and society. They weave fresh patterns of argument, challenge old assumptions, propose new vistas. And so the tapestry grows. My hope is that in the fullness of time, this conversation fosters not just knowledge but wisdom, an understanding of how to live ethically in a precarious world. Now, in my later years, I recline in my study, surrounded by half-finished manuscripts on logic and social commentary. My heart is weighted by the tragedies of war, yet also lifted by the potential I see in humanity. I reread letters from old apostles, hear their voices in my head. I realize that their presence shaped me, accompanied me through life's triumphs and defeats, never letting me sink into complacency. That persistent questioning mind, call it the apostle's gift, remains my closest companion. I sometimes imagine a future meeting, long after I'm gone. A young philosopher stands in that old Trinity room, reading a paper on the moral ramifications of some newly discovered technology. Others lounge on battered armchairs, pipes or notebooks in hand, volleying critiques and expansions. The flicker of a modern lamp replaces the candlelight of Tomlinson's day, but the atmosphere is the same, intense, honest, egalitarian. No dogma allowed, no easy platitudes, only the relentless, joyful pursuit of better understanding. Thus I end my chronicle, hoping it sheds some light on what it means to be an apostle. We debated large ideas in small rooms, forging improbable bonds that transcended differences of class, creed, generation. If there is any redemption for a world so often torn by conflict and confusion, it may lie in spaces like these, where conversation is not a weapon but a bridge, and where the best minds gather not to impose their will, but to refine their search for truth. In that sense, the Cambridge Apostles, across these centuries, has always stood for a promise that human minds, united in friendship, might yet discover how to live with dignity and grace.